Mealy joins me now to discuss more about the Asian-African Summit. He's the Vice President of Policy at the US-ASEAN Business Council. Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. Thanks for having me.
A lot is being talked about, and there are some very big words being said. There's big promises, and we're starting to see perhaps a little movement on it. And let me start with the taxes issue. Okay. President Xi talking about this zero tariff. Explain to our audience why. I mean, I don't want to get too technical, but why is this such a big deal?
Sure. Well, for many developing countries, particularly in Asia and Africa, the kinds of things which they'd like to be exporting to the world, particularly to wealthier countries, they oftentimes face import duties. So Europe and taxes, correct. And so Europe and America have always had, not always, but for many, many years have had programs which allow those products to come from poorer countries in tax-free. So it's very powerful now to see China also sort of match that same kind of program to let developing countries send their products into China also tax-free.
So, I mean, it seems like just as a regular person looking at this, it's good for China because they could do more business elsewhere, and I imagine they're selling more products abroad.
Sure.
And for a lot of these countries, they're going to be able to develop a lot faster and possibly have more money and resources to utilize as well. Is it that simple that it's a win-win?
Well, I think it's very simple in a sense because we all know that China's economy is really growing rapidly throughout the world. It's becoming a major source of consumption, still not quite at the levels of America and sort of Western Europe, but the fact remains all the forecasts say that China's economy is going to become the biggest economy in the world in the 21st century. So therefore, if China can become a major source of purchasing goods and services from developing countries, that helps development.
When you talk about Africa, I mean, everyone realizes they are behind in terms of infrastructure investment, but they're also behind in terms of like structure, rule of law. To build hospitals and bridges, you have to have companies come in that are very well organized, and there's certain rules and protocols to follow.
Sure.
Is it ready?
Well, I think there are economies that are moving in that kind of direction. There's several folks in East Africa.
So it's uneven, is what you're saying?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, you have to really go to the individual countries on the African continent where you can find progress. It would be a mistake to sort of say blanket across the board that none of these societies are moving in that kind of direction. You've got several economies on the continent that are actually going to be developing into oil exporting countries, which historically has sometimes presented new challenges. Yeah. But in terms of having additional financial resources, hopefully properly invested in infrastructure with better sort of rules of the road, that can also better position those economies to move forward.
So China's there, they're having a big party, everyone's happy. Where's the US, where's Europe, where's the rest of the world? What's going on?
Well, I think from the global business perspective, I mean, while many of us are focused on the big trade talks here in the United States, the fact remains there are lots of major, significantly impacting global initiatives going on in Asia. So whether you're talking about regional integration in Southeast Asia, big pan-Asian free trade agreements going on, negotiations also underway throughout the Asia-Pacific region. So global business, where if they're starting with the basic question, where is the growth? The growth increasingly is in Asia, it is in Africa, so therefore they are looking at these markets, these kinds of opportunities. And to the degree that you see greater sort of cooperation and connection between African economies and Asian economies, that's also going to be very positive for business.
You know what just occurred to me? We talk about trade a lot on this show.
Sure.
And you think of the transatlantic partnership and the Pacific partnership, and we can go on and on about the different deals that are being done. It almost means they don't mean much anymore because pretty soon everyone's going to have a deal with almost everyone else, right? I mean, we're seeing the walls of resistance and challenges come down at a pace that I don't ever recall it happening at.
Well, I think we are in a new sort of era in terms of the globalization kind of period where these kinds of multilateral trade initiatives are underway. One never knows where a negotiation will end up, but the fact remains there are now more countries that are entering into these kinds of processes that if there's
free trade deals here,
exactly.
I mean, that's what we're talking about.
Exactly.
So why not just have all the countries drop all their taxes?
Well,
what's the problem?
One might think that might be an economically sound
we're heading there already.
But politically, every country faces their own sensitivities and challenges, and therefore it does become a negotiation. But that's why, if you recall, some of the struggles that we've had in the World Trade Organization to where you do have the whole world together, those troubles, I think, have actually been catalysts for smaller groups of countries to sort of pursue these kinds of initiatives because they really couldn't get them a full consensus at the global level.
You brought this up. We talked about these new deals. Do those new deals supersede the World Trade Organization? Does it dilute their power? I mean, it's hard to not think it does?
Well, in some ways it can. I think for the countries that are prepared to sort of go further than the rest of the world is at a WTO, it does sort of probably create some new additional advantages, maybe for companies and businesses and investors in those markets. I think but there is a bit of a, how you say, a competitive liberalization dynamic. I think it also kind of spurs greater calls for, we should get the WTO also going as well, because if we don't, these other agreements will sort of basically make the WTO less significant.